Good afternoon, friends. I'm Charlotte, and this is Quarantine story time, when we have been using the shelter in place from COVID-19 and the mass national shutdown in the US to read a very classic piece of Western literature, Russian literature, War and Peace, one of the longest books in, I guess, European history. One of the longest novels of all time, a very classic piece of work, and, as we've discovered, a very interesting and insightful piece of work with excellent character development and intriguing observations of the human condition. So we've been reading that, and if this is your first time, welcome. If this is not, which I'm sure many of you have been here before, welcome back. I hope you guys didn't suffer too much from the suspense about the battle, because we're now in 1812 and Napoleon has invaded Russia. The Russian forces have been pushed back, and we're on the brink. Napoleon is on the brink of invading Moscow, and many of our main characters are now on the brink of a battle with Napoleon that will determine whether or not he can take Moscow. Woohoo! Exciting stuff. Always check out the playlist on my channel if you missed anything, and if you did, feel free to watch an older video to get caught back up. And if you didn't, make sure you subscribe so that you always know when I'm going live, which is helpful. I always try to have the video up or going live, already up or going live by 3 o'clock. So if you check the channel around 3 o'clock every day, Monday through Friday, you should be able to either tune in live or watch a previously recorded thing if I anticipate not being able to be live by 3. So there's that. That's basically my gist. I'm trying to be as consistent as possible, but with these uncertain times, just never know. But good news is we're making a lot of progress. And after today's reading, we will be 2/3 of the way through the book. So without any further ado, maybe we should jump in. We are reading Volume 3, Part 2, Section 34. Well, 31 to 34. I can do this. And as we left off, Pierre, I had coffee today. I just had coffee. Oh, did the most millennial thing in quarantine that I could possibly do. I made homemade sourdough bread last night. It was very nice because it's like a honey milk loaf that I got from This African Cooks cooking website. She has a great honey milk bread recipe for sourdough starters. So if you're out there making sourdough starters, I highly recommend you check out her recipe and probably the rest of her blog. I really just got stuck on that one bread recipe and I make it all the time. It's great for sandwiches and toast. So good. So I made that last night. So I made avocado toast today because millennial life. And I finally gave into all the TikTok and, social media crazes around whipped coffee. Made my own whipped coffee today. I haven't had coffee in like a week at least. And I did a double serving. Oh my goodness, this is going to be such a fun reading. I'm so caffeinated right now. I don't know if all the whipping was worth it. I gave myself a blister hand whipping it, but it was delicious. Like coffee usually is. So sorry if I am spicy. But anyways, so in today's reading, we're picking up where Pierre went galloping off a general at the beginning of the battle. This is August 26th, the year 1812. And Pierre, while usually a man of indecision, has finally decided to join up with the army to see what's going on because he believes there's some spiritual significance in Napoleon's invasion of Russia and also in his needing to be involved in it somehow. So there's that. It has to do with the Mark of the Beast and Revelations and all that kind of stuff. So, which is interesting to me because I feel like in every time period, people are always trying to look to old prophecies and are like, this is what this prophecy is referring to me right now, until like it comes and goes, and then they're like, okay, maybe not. And then someone else is like, no, it refers to me. So we always find significance in our moments, both the moments we're in and in hindsight looking back on them, which I think has been a universal theme in War and Peace. But anyways, so Pierre is about to, I think he's mostly just going to observe this battle. He's not like geared up like he's going to be part of it, but he wants to be there to watch it. which is just weird to me because if you think about now, like, no one's like, you know what I want to do? I'm going to go watch this battle happening. Most people try to get away from the battle unless you're actually involved in it. But anywho, that's that. And so I probably should stop rambling and get on with it. In the immortal words of Monty Python, get on with it. And I have the live chat up, so feel free to say hi. Say something nice, you know. Ooh, there's a little bit of thunder. Hopefully we'll get thunder for this battle like we did that one. That would be great. All right. Anyways, without further ado, Volume 3, Part 2, Section 31. The general whom Pierre went galloping after, having gone down the hill, turned sharply to the left, and Pierre, losing sight of him, rode into the ranks of some infantry who were marching ahead of him. He tried to get out of them to the left, but everywhere there were soldiers with equally preoccupied faces, busy with some invisible but obviously important matters. They all looked with equally displeased and questioning eyes at this fat man in a white hat who, for some unknown reason, was trampling at them with his horse. "Why go riding in the middle of a battalion?" one cried to him. Another shoved his horse with the butt of his musket, and Pierre, clinging to the pommel, barely controlling the shying horse, galloped out ahead of the soldiers where there was more room. Ahead of him was a bridge, and at the bridge more soldiers stood shooting. Pierre rode up to them. Without knowing it himself, Pierre had come as far as the bridge over the Kalosha, which was between Gorky and Borodino, and which the French, having taken Borodino, attacked in the first action of the battle. Pierre saw that there was a bridge ahead of him, and that on both sides of the bridge and on the meadow, among those rows of mowed hay he had noticed the day before, soldiers were doing something in the smoke. But despite the incessant shooting that was going on there, it never occurred to him that this was precisely the field of battle. He did not hear the sounds of the bullet whining on all sides and the shells that flew over his head, did not see the enemy on the other side of the river, and for a long time did not see the dead and wounded, though many fell not far from him. With a smile that never left his face, he looked about him. "What's that one doing, riding in the front of the line?" someone cried to him. "Go left, go right," they shouted to him. Pierre pulled to the right and unexpectedly ran into General Revsky's adjutant, whom he knew. This adjutant also glanced angrily at Pierre, who was obviously about to shout at him, but recognizing him, nodded his head. "What are you doing here?" he said, and rode on. Pierre, feeling out of place and having nothing to do, afraid of getting in someone's way, rode after the adjutant. Is it here or what? Can I come with you?" he asked. Sorry, I'm a little bit animated today. Welcome one and everyone. "Is it here or what? Can I come with you?" he asked. One moment, replied the adjutant, and riding up to a fat colonel who was standing in the meadow, he said something to him, and only then turned to Pierre. "How did you end up here, Count?" he said with a smile. Still curious? Yes, said Pierre, but the adjutant, turning his horse, was riding on. "Here it's not bad, thank God," said the adjutant, "but on the left flank, with Bagration, it's getting terribly hot." "Really?" asked Pierre. "Where's that?" "Come to the barrow with me, and you can see it from there. It's still bearable over our battery," said the adjutant. "Are you coming?" "Yes, I'll come with you," said Pierre, looking around, his eyes seeking his groom. Only here, for the first time, did Pierre see the wounded, trudging on foot or carried on stretchers. On the same little meadow with the fragrant rows of hay over which he had ridden the day before, across the rows, his head twisted awkwardly, a soldier lay motionless, his shako fallen off. "Why didn't they pick that one up?" Pierre began, but seeing the stern faces of the adjutant who was looking in the same direction, he fell silent. Pierre did not find his groom, and rode with the adjutant along the hollow towards Revsky's barrow. Pierre's horse lagged behind the adjutant's and jolted him rhythmically. "You're evidently not used to riding horseback, Count?" asked the adjutant. "No, it's all right, but she's somehow bouncing a lot," Pierre said in perplexity. She's wounded," said the adjutant. "It's in the right foreleg, above the knee. Must have been a bullet." "Congratulations, Count," he said. "Le baptême de feu." Baptism of fire. Having ridden in smoke through the 6th Corps behind the artillery, which, moving forward, was shouting, deafening them with its gunfire, they came to a small woods. In the woods it was cool, quiet, and smelled of autumn. Pierre and the adjutant got off their horses and went up the hill on foot. "Is the general here?" asked the adjutant, coming to the barrow. He was just here. He rode off that way," they answered, pointing to the right. The adjutant looked at Pierre as if not knowing what to do with him now. "Don't worry," said Pierre. "I'll go up to the barrow, if I may." "Yes, do. You'll see everything from there, and it's not so dangerous. I'll come to fetch you." Pierre went up to the battery, and the adjutant rode on. They saw no more of each other, and much later Pierre learned that this adjutant had had his arm shot off that day. The barrow that Pierre went up was that famous place, later known to the Russians as the Battery of the Barrows, or the Radski's Battery, and to the French as Le Garde Redoubt, Le Fatal Redoubt, La Redoubt du Centre, around which tens of thousands of men were brought down, and which the French considered the most important point of the position. This redoubt consisted of a barrow in which trenches had been dug on 3 sides. In the area surrounded by the trenches stood 10 cannon, firing through the openings in the rampart. In line with the barrow on both sides, cannon also stood, firing steadily. Slightly behind the cannon stood infantry. Going up this barrow, Pierre had no notion that this place, surrounded by small trenches, where a few cannon stood firing, was the most important place in the battle. On the contrary, it seemed to Pierre that this place, precisely because he was there, was one of the most insignificant places of the battle. Having come up onto the barrow, Pierre sat down at the end of the trench that was surrounded the battery, and with an unconsciously joyful smile, looked up at what was happening around him. Now and then Pierre, with that same smile, got up and, trying not to bother the soldiers who were loading and rolling the guns, and who constantly ran past him with sacks and charges, strolled around the battery. The cannon of this battery fired steadily, one after the other, with a deafening roar, and covered the whole area with powder smoke. In contrast to the dread that was felt among the covering infantrymen, here at the battery, where a small number of people busy with their work were restricted, separated from the others by a trench, here one could feel a sort of family animation, the same and common to them all. The appearance of Pierre's non-military figure in the white hat struck these men unpleasantly at first. The soldiers, passing by him, looked askance, with surprise and even fear at his figure. The senior artillery officer, a tall, long-legged, pockmarked man, came up to Pierre as if in order to check the action of the end cannon, and glanced at him curiously. A young, round-faced little officer, still a perfect child, obviously just out of cadet school, commanding quite diligently the 2 cannons entrusted him, addressed Pierre sternly. "Allow me, sir, to ask you to clear the way," he said. "You cannot be here." The soldiers shook their head disapprovingly, looking at Pierre. But when they all became convinced that this man in the white hat not only was not doing any harm, but either sat peaceably on the slope of the rampart or, with the timid smile politely making way for the soldiers, strolled around the battery under fire as calmly as if it were a boulevard, the feeling of hostile perplexity towards him gradually began to turn into a gentle and jocular sympathy, similar to what soldiers feel for their animals, the dogs, cocks, goats, and animals generally that live with military units. Then the soldiers mentally received Pierre into their family, adopted him, and gave him the nickname "Our Master," they nicknamed him, and gently made fun of him among themselves. One cannonball plowed up the dirt 2 steps from Pierre. He looked around with a smile, brushing off the dirt as it splattered on his clothes. How is it you're not afraid, master, really?" a stocky, red-mugged soldier addressed Pierre, baring his strong white teeth. "Are you afraid?" asked Pierre. "What else?" answered the soldier. "She's got no pity. She smacks down and guts spill out. Impossible not to be afraid," he said, laughing. Several soldiers with cheerful and gentle faces stopped near Pierre. It was as if they did not expect him to talk like everybody else and were glad of this discovery. "Ours is soldierly business, but for a master it's amazing. Some master he is." "To your places," cried the young officer to the soldiers gathering around Pierre. This young officer was clearly carrying out his duties for the first or second time, and therefore addressed both the soldiers and the superior with special precision and formality. The rolling fire of cannon and muskets was growing more intense over the field, especially to the left where Bagration's flèches were, but due to the smoke of gunfire in the place where Pierre was, almost nothing could be seen. Besides, observing the family-like circle of men, separated from all the others, who were there on the battery, absorbed all Pierre's attention. His first unconsciously joyful excitement, produced by the sight and sound of the battlefield, had now been replaced, especially after seeing the soldier lying solitary on the field, by a different feeling. Sitting on the side of the trench now, he observed the faces around him. By 10 o'clock, some 20 men had already been carried from the battery. 2 guns had been smashed, shells were hitting the battery more and more often, and bullets whizzing and whistling reached them from far away. But it was as if the men were on the battery did not notice it. On all sides, merry talk and joking were heard. "A stuffed one!" a soldier cried at an approaching shell, whistling as it flew. "Not here! To the infantry!" another added with a laugh, noticing that the shell had flown over and hit the ranks of the cowering troops. "What, a friend of yours?" another soldier laughed as at a muzhik who ducked under a flying cannonball. Several soldiers gathered at the rampart, gazing at what was happening further ahead. "They've drawn in the front line, you see. They've backed up," they said. pointing over the rampart. Mind your own business, an old sergeant shouted to them. If they're backed up, it means they've got business back there. And he took one of the soldiers by the shoulder and kicked him with his knee. There was laughter. Roll up the 5th gun, a cry came from one side. All at once, together, like boatmen. Merry cries were heard as they changed cannon. Aye, it's almost knocked off our master's little hat, the red-mugged joker laughed at Pierre, showing his teeth. Ah, clumsy girl, he added reproachfully to a cannonball that struck a wheel and a man's leg. Well, you foxes, another laughed at the crouching militiamen who came to the battery to fetch the wounded. So you don't like the porridge? Ah, you crows, you're scared stiff, they shouted at the militiamen who faltered before a soldier with a shot-off leg. So it goes, lads, they mimicked the musics. They really don't like it. Pierre noticed how, after every cannonball hit its mark, after every loss, the general animation flared up more. As in an approaching storm cloud, there flashes more and more often, more and more brightly on the faces of all these men, as if in resistance to what was happening, the lightning of a hidden fire flaring up. Pierre did not look ahead at the battlefield and was not interested in knowing what was going on there. He was entirely absorbed in contemplating this fire flaring up more and more, which, he felt, was also flaring up in his soul. Pierre did not look ahead at the battlefield and was not interested in knowing what was going on there. He was absorbed in contemplating this fire flaring more and more, which he felt also flaring up in his soul. At 10 o'clock, the infantrymen who had been in the bushes in front of the battery and along the Kamenka River retreated. From the battery, they could be seen running back past it, carrying the wounded on muskets. Some general with his suite came up on the barrow and, having talked with the colonel, glared angrily at Pierre and went down again, ordering the covering infantry who stood behind the battery to lie down so as to be less exposed to fire. After that, from the ranks of infantry to the right of the battery, came the sound of a drum, shouts of command, and it could be seen from the battery that those flanks of infantry were moving forward. Pierre looked over the rampart. One face especially struck his eyes. It was a pale young face of an officer who was marching backwards, carrying a lowered sword, glancing uneasily over his shoulder. The ranks of the infantrymen disappeared into the smoke. Their drawn-out cry was heard, and then rapid musket fire. A few moments later, crowds of wounded and stretchers came back from there. Projectiles began falling still more frequently on the battery. Several men lay there and were not carried away. The soldier bustled more animatedly around the cannon. No one paid further attention to Pierre. He was shouted at a couple of times for being in the way. The senior officer, frowning, moved from one gun to another with big, quick strides. The young little officer, still more flushed, commanded the soldiers still more diligently. The soldiers handed on charges, turned, loaded, and did their work with tense jauntiness. They bobbed as if on strings as they were walked. The storm cloud came near, and the fire whose flaring up Pierre had been watching now burned brightly on all faces. He stood beside the senior officer. The young little officer, his hand on his shako, came running up to the one older one. I have the honor to report, Colonel, that there are only 8 charges left. Do you order us to continue firing? He asked. Canister shot, the senior officer cried without answering, looking over the rampart. Suddenly something happened. The little officer said, "Ah!" and curling up, sat on the ground like a bird shot down in flight. Everything became strange, vague, and bleak in Pierre's eyes. One after another, cannonballs came whistling and struck the breastwork, the soldiers, the cannon. Pierre, who had previously had not heard these sounds, now heard nothing else. To the right side of the battery, soldiers with cries of "Hurrah!" were running not forward but back, as it seemed to Pierre. A cannonball struck the very edge of the rampart before which Pierre was standing, scattering dirt, and in his eyes a black ball flashed and in that same instant smacked into something. The militiamen who were just coming into the battery ran back again. "All canister shot!" cried the officer. The sergeant ran up to the senior officer, and in a frightened whisper, the way a butler reports to his master at a dinner that they have run out of the wine he requested, said that they had run out of charges. "The brigands, what are they doing?" shouted the officer, turning to Pierre. The senior officer's face was red and sweaty. His frowning eyes flashed. "Run to the reserves! Bring the caissons!" he cried, angrily avoiding Pierre with his glance and turning to his soldier. "I'll go," said Pierre. The officer, without answering him, walked off in the other direction with big strides. "Hold your fire! Wait!" he cried. The soldier who had been ordered to go for the charges collided with Pierre. "Eh, master, this is no place for you," he said, and ran down. Pierre ran after the soldier, avoiding the place where the young little officer sat. One cannonball, a second, a third flew over him, landing in front, on the sides, behind. Pierre went running down. "Where am I going?" he suddenly tried to recall, already running up to the green caissons. He stopped, undecided whether to go back or go on. Suddenly, a terrible shock threw him backwards onto the ground, and at the same instant the flash of a big fire lit him up, and at the same instant a deafening roar, crash, and the whistling rang in his ears. When he came to, Pierre was sitting on his behind, his hands propped on the ground. The caisson he had been closest to was not there. Only charred green boards and rags lay about on the scorched grass, and a horse, dragging broken shafts, trotted past him, while another, just like Pierre himself, lay on the ground and shrieked long and piercingly. Section 32. Forgetting himself from fear, Pierre jumped up and ran back to the battery as the sole refuge from all the horrors that surrounded him. Just as Pierre was entering the earthworks, he noticed that there was no shooting to be heard on the battery, but some people were doing something there. Pierre had no time to realize who these people were. He saw the senior colonel lying back to him on the rampart, as if studying something below, and saw one soldier he had noticed before, who, tearing away from the people who were holding him behind by the arm, was shouting, "Brothers!" And he saw something else strange. But he had no time to realize that the colonel had been killed, that the other one shouting "Brothers" was a prisoner, that before his eyes another soldier was being bayoneted in the back. He had only just run into the earthworks when a gaunt yellow man with a sweaty face in a blue uniform with a sword in his hand came charging at him, shouting something. Pierre, instinctively defending himself against the shock, because they were running into each other without seeing it, put his hands out and seized the man, it was a French officer, by the shoulder with one hand and by the throat with the other. The officer, letting go of the sword, seized Pierre by the collar. For a few seconds, the two men looked with frightened eyes into their mutually alien faces. Both were perplexed about what they had done and what they were to do. Am I taken prisoner, or have I taken him prisoner? Each of them thought, but evidently the French officer was more inclined to the thought that he had been taken prisoner, because Pierre's strong hand, moved by involuntary fear, squeezed his throat more and more tightly. The Frenchman wanted to say something, but suddenly a cannonball came whistling, low and terrible, just over their heads, and Pierre fancied that the French officer's head had been torn off, so he ducked so quickly. Pierre also ducked in his head and released his grip. No longer thinking of who had captured whom, the Frenchman ran back to the battery, and Pierre ran down the hill, stumbling over the dead and wounded, who, it seemed to him, tried to catch him by the legs. But before he got all the way down, dense crowds of Russian soldiers appeared before him, who, falling, stumbling, and shouting, ran merrily and stormingly up to the battery. This was the attack which Ermolov took credit for, saying that only his courage and good luck had made possible this exploit, during which he supposedly threw up onto the barrow some St. George's crosses that he had in his pocket. The French, who had taken the barrow, fled. Our troops, with shouts of "Hurrah!" chased the French so far beyond the battery that it was hard to stop them. The prisoners were brought down from the battery, among them a wounded French general, who was surrounded by officers. Crowds of wounded, familiar and unfamiliar to Pierre, Russian and French, with faces disfigured by suffering, walked, crawled, and were carried on the stretchers from the battery. Pierre went up to the barrow, where he had spent more than an hour, and of that family circle which had taken him to itself, he found not a single one. There were many dead whom he did not know, but some he recognized. The young little officer sat in the same curled-up way by the edge of the rampart in a pool of blood. The red, mugged soldier was still twitching, but they did not take him away. Pierre ran down. No, now they'll stop it. Now they'll be horrified at what they've done, he thought, aimlessly falling behind the crowds of stretchers moving off the battlefield. But the sun, veiled in smoke, was still high, and ahead, and especially to the left near Semyonovsko, something seethed in the smoke, and the roar of gunfire, musketry, and cannonades not only did not abate, but intensified to the point of despair, like a straining man crying out with his last strength. Section 33. The main action of the Battle of Borodino took place over a stretch of 7,000 feet between Borodino and Bagration's Fletches. Outside that stretch, on one side, there was a show of Uvarov's cavalry in the middle of the day, and on the other side, beyond Utitsa, there was a clash between Poniatowski and Tuchkov. But these were separate and weak actions compared with what was happening in the middle of the battlefield. On the field between Borodino and the Fletches, by the woods, on a stretch open and visible from both sides, the main action of the battle took place in the most simple, artless way. The battle began with a cannonade from both sides out of several hundred guns. Then, when smoke lay over the whole battlefield, through this smoke, from the right, on the French side, and the two divisions of Dessay and Campons moved against the Fletches, and from the left, the Viceroy's regiments moved against Borodino. From the Shevardino redoubt, where Napoleon stood, the Fletches were 2/3 of a mile away, and Borodino more than a mile and a third away as the crow flies, and therefore Napoleon could not see what was going on there. The less so as smoke, merging with the mist, covered the whole terrain. The soldiers of Desaix's division sent against the Fletches could be seen only until they descended into the gully that separated them from the Fletches. As soon as they descended into the gully, the smoke of the cannon and the musket fire on the Fletches became so thick that it obscured the whole ascent up the other side of the gully. There were glimpses of something black through the smoke, probably men, and an occasional gleam of bayonets. But whether they were moving or standing still, whether they were French or Russian, could not be seen from the Shevardino redoubt. The sun rose brightly, and in the slanting rays struck Napoleon straight in the face as he looked at the Fletches from under his hand. Smoke spread in front of the Fletches, and now it seemed that the smoke was moving. Now the troops were moving. The shouts of men were occasionally heard through the gunfire, but it was impossible to know what was being done there. Napoleon, standing on the barrows, looking through a field glass, and through the small circle of the field glass, he saw smoke and people, sometimes his own, sometimes Russians, but when he looked again with the naked eye, he could not tell what he had seen was. He went down from the barrow and began pacing in front of it. Now and then he stopped, listened to the gunfire, and peered at the battlefield. Not only from the place below where he was standing, not only from the barrow where some of his generals now stood, but from the Fletches themselves, on which, together or alternately, there were now Russian, now French soldiers, dead, wounded, and alive, frightened or panic-stricken. It was impossible to understand what was happening in that place. In the course of several hours on that place, amidst the incessant firing of muskets and cannons, there were appearing now only Russian soldiers, now only French, now infantry, now cavalry. They appeared, fell, fired, collided, not knowing what to do with each other, shouted, and ran back again. From the battlefield, the adjutants he had sent and his marshal's orderlies constantly came galloping to Napoleon with reports on the course of events. But all these reports were false, both because in the heat of battle it was impossible to tell what was going on at a given moment, and because many of the adjutants did not reach the actual place of battle, but told what they had heard from others, and also because, while an adjutant was riding the mile or more that separated him from Napoleon, the circumstances changed, and the news he was bringing became incorrect. Thus an adjutant arrived from the Viceroy with news that Borodino was taken and the bridge over the Kolosha was in the hands of the French. The adjutant asked Napoleon if he ordered the troops to cross it. Napoleon ordered them to form ranks on the other side and wait. But not only as Napoleon was giving this order, but even as the adjutant was leaving Borodino, the bridge was already retaken and burned by the Russians, in that same skirmish which Pierre took part in at the very beginning of the battle. An adjutant came galloping from the Fletches with a pale, frightened face to inform Napoleon that the attack had been repulsed and that the Compans had been wounded and Devout killed. But meanwhile, the Fletches had been taken by another section of troops, just as the adjutant was being told that the French had been repulsed, and Devout was alive and only slightly bruised. On the weight of such unavoidably false reports, Napoleon gave his instructions, which either had been carried out before he had even given them, or were not and could not be carried out. Marshals and generals who were closer to the battlefield, but who, like Napoleon, did not take part in the battle itself, but were only occasionally rode into the fire, gave their own instructions and orders about where to shoot and from where, and where the cavalry were to ride and the infantry to run, without asking Napoleon. But even their instructions were carried out as rarely and to as small degree as Napoleon's instructions. For the most part, what came out was the opposite of what they had ordered. Soldiers who were told to advance would come under canister shot and run back. Soldiers who were told to stay where they were, suddenly seeing the Russians appear unexpectedly before them, sometimes ran back and sometimes rushed forward, and the cavalry galloped without orders in pursuit of the fleeing Russians. Thus, 2 cavalry regiments galloped through Semyonovskoe Gully, and as soon as they rode up the hill, turned and galloped back at top speed. The infantrymen acted in the same way, sometimes getting nowhere near where they were told to go. All instructions about where and when to move cannon, and when to send foot soldiers to shoot, and when mounted soldiers to trample the Russian foot, all these instructions were given by commanders closest to the units, in the ranks, without even asking. Ney, Devout, and Murat, not to mention Napoleon. They were not afraid of being punished for non-fulfillment of orders or for unauthorized instructions, because in battle it was a matter of what is dearest to a man, his own life, and it sometimes seemed that the salvation lies in running back, sometimes in running forward, and these people, finding themselves in the very heat of battle, acted in conformity with the mood of the moment. In reality, all these movements forwards and backwards did nothing to alleviate or alter the situation of the troops. All their assaults and attacks on each other caused almost no harm. The harm, death, and mutilation were caused by the cannonballs and bullets that flew everywhere through the space in which these men rushed about. As soon as these men left that space through which the cannonballs and bullets flew, their commanders, who stood in the rear, formed them up, established discipline, and under the effect of that discipline, again led them into the zone of fire, in which, under the effect of fear of death, they again lost discipline and rushed about according to the chance mood of the crowd. Section 34. Napoleon's generals, Davout, Ney, and Murat, who were in proximity to the zone of fire and even occasionally rode into it, several times led huge and orderly masses of troops into that zone of fire. But, contrary to what involuntarily happened in all previous battles, instead of the expected news of the enemy's flight, the orderly masses of troops came back from there as disorderly, frightened crowds. They restored them to order, but the men were becoming fewer. Halfway through the day, Murat sent his adjutants to Napoleon to ask for reinforcements. Napoleon was sitting at the foot of the barrow and drinking punch when Murat's adjutant galloped up to him with assurances that the Russians would be crushed if His Majesty gave them one more division. Reinforcements, said Napoleon with stern astonishment, as if failing to understand his words, and gazing at the handsome boy adjutant with his long curled black hair, the same way Murat did his hair. Reinforcements, thought Napoleon. What sort of reinforcements can they ask for when they've got half an army in their hands, directed against a weak, unfortified Russian wing? Dites à Roi de Naples, Napoleon said sternly, qu'il n'est pas midi et que je ne vois pas encore clair sur mon échiquier. Allez! Tell the King of Naples that it's not yet midday and I still don't see my chessboard clearly. Go. The handsome boy adjutant with long hair, not taking his hand from his hat, sighed deeply and galloped back to where people were being killed. Napoleon stood up and, summoning Caulaincourt and Berthier, began talking with them about matters that did not concern the battle. In the middle of the conversation, which had begun to interest Napoleon, Berthier's eyes turned towards a general with a suite, who was galloping towards the barrow on a lathered horse. It was Belle-Alde. He dismounted, stepped quickly up to the emperor, and boldly, in a loud voice, began demonstrating the necessity for reinforcements. He swore on his honor that the Russians would be destroyed if the emperor gave one more division. Napoleon heaved his shoulders and, saying nothing in reply, continued on his walk. Belle-Alde began talking loudly and animatedly with the generals of the suite who surrounded him. You're all fired up, Belle-Alde, said Napoleon, coming to the newly arrived general. It's easy to make mistakes in the heat of fire. Go and have a look, and then come back to me. But Belle-Alde had no time to disappear from view before a new messenger from the battlefield came galloping from the other side. Eh bien, qu'est-ce qu'il y a, eh? Napoleon said in the tone of a man vexed at being constantly bothered. Sire, le prince, began the adjutant. Ask for reinforcements, Napoleon said with an angry gesture. The adjutant inclined his head affirmatively and began his report, but the emperor turned away from him, went 2 steps, stopped, and came back, and summoned Berthier. We must give them the reserves, he said, spreading his arms slightly. Who should we send in? What do you think? He addressed Berthier. That, au son qu'elle fait Aigle, as he referred to him later. Shall we send in Claparède's division, sire? Said Berthier, who knew all the divisions, regiments, and battalions by heart. Napoleon nodded his head affirmatively. The adjutant galloped to Claparède's division, and after a few moments later, the young guard unit that was stationed behind the barrow started from its place. Napoleon silently looked in that direction. No, he turned suddenly to Berthier. I can't send Claparède's. Send Friant's division, he said. Though there was no advantage in sending Friant's division instead of Claparède's, there was an obvious inconvenience and delay in stopping Claparède's now and sending in Friant's. The order was carried out with precision. Napoleon did not see that, in relation to his troops, he was playing the role of the doctor whose medications are a hindrance, a role he so correctly understood and disapproved of. Friant's division, like all of the others, disappeared into the smoke of the battlefield. From all sides, adjutants continued to come galloping, and all of them, as if by agreement, said one and the same thing. They all asked for reinforcements. They all said that the Russians were holding their position and keeping up un feu d'enfer, before which the French army was melting away. Napoleon sat on his camp chair deep in thought. Having grown hungry since morning, Monsieur de Busset, the lover of travel, came to the emperor and ventured to suggest respectfully that His Majesty have lunch. I hope that I may already congratulate your Majesty on a victory, he said. Napoleon said nothing and shook his head negatively. Supposing that the negation referred to the victory and not to lunch, Monsieur de Besset allowed himself to observe with playful respect that there was nothing in the world that could interfere with taking lunch when it was possible to do so. Allez-vous, Napoleon suddenly said gloomily and turned away. A blissful smile of regret, repentance, and rapture lit up Monsieur Besset's face, and with gliding steps he went over to the other generals. Napoleon was experiencing a painful feeling similar to that which is always experienced by a lucky gambler who madly threw his money about, always won, and suddenly, precisely when he has calculated all the chances of the game, feels that the more he thinks over his move, the more certain he is to lose. The troops were the same. The generals were the same. There were the same preparations, the same dispositions, the same proclamation called the énergique. He himself was the same. He knew it. He knew he was much more experienced and skillful now than he was before. Even the enemy was the same as at Austerlitz and Friedland, but the terrible swing of the arm fell magically strengthless. All the old methods, which had invariably been crowned with success, concentrating the batteries on a single point, attacking with the reserves to break the line, attacking with les hommes de fer of the cavalry, all these methods had already been employed, and not only was there no victory, but from all sides came the news of killed and wounded generals, of the need for reinforcements, of the impossibility of dislodging the Russians, and of disarray among the troops. Formally, after 2 or 3 instructions, 2 or 3 phrases, the marshals and adjutants had come galloping with congratulations and cheerful faces, had announced trophies of whole corps of prisoners, des fessiers de drapeaux et des angles d'ennemis, of cannons and baggage trains, and Murat had asked only for permission to let the cavalry take the baggage trains. It had been that way at Lodi, Marengo, Arcole, Jena, Austerlitz, Wagram, and so on and so forth. But now something strange was happening with his troops. Despite the news of taking the flèches, Napoleon saw that this was different, quite different from all his previous battles. He saw that the same feeling he experienced was being experienced by all the people around him. Battle-seasoned as they were, all their faces were sad. They all avoided each other's eyes. Busset alone could not understand the meaning of what was happening, but Napoleon, after his long experience of war, knew very well what it meant when, in the course of 8 hours, after making every effort, the attacking army had not won the battle. He knew that this was almost a lost battle, and that the smallest chance, at that precarious point of indecision the battle had come to, could destroy him and his troops. When he went through it in imagination the whole of this strange Russian campaign, in which not a single battle had been won, in which no banners, no cannon, no corps of troops had been taken in 2 months, when he looked at the hidden sadness on the faces around him and listened to the reports that the Russians still stood their ground, a terrible feeling, like one experienced in a dream, seized him, and all the unlucky chances that could destroy him came to his mind. The Russians could assault his left wing, could break through his center. A stray cannonball could kill him. It was all possible. In his former battles he had thought only of the chances of his success, but now he imagined a countless number of unlucky ones, and he expected them all. Yes, it was as in a dream when a man sees a villain coming at him, and in his dream the man swings and hits the villain with terrible force which he knows should destroy him, and he feels his arm fall strengthless and limp as a rag, and the terror of irresistible destruction takes hold of the helpless man. The news that the Russians were attacking the left flank of the French army awakened this terror in Napoleon. He sat silently on a camp chair at the foot of the barrow, his head lowered and his elbows on his knees. Berthier came up to him and suggested that they ride along the line to ascertain what position things were in. "What? What's that you say?" said Napoleon. "Yes, tell them to bring my horse." He mounted up and rode to Semyonovskoe. In the slowly dispersing powder smoke over the whole space through which Napoleon was riding, horses and men lay in pools of blood, singly and in heaps. Never yet had Napoleon or any of his generals seen such horror, so many men killed on such a small space. The roar of guns, which for 10 hours had never ceased to torment the ear, gave the spectacle a special significance, like the music in a tableau vivant. Napoleon rode out to the height of Semyonovskoe and saw ranks of men in uniforms of a color his eyes were not accustomed to. These were Russians. The Russians stood in close ranks behind Semyonovskoe and the barrow, and their guns roared and smoked without ceasing along their line. There was no longer any battle. There was a continuous slaughter, which could lead nowhere either for the Russians or for the French. Napoleon stopped his horse and again fell into that pensiveness which Berthier had brought him out of. He could not stop what was happening before him and around him, which was considered to be guided by him and dependent on him, and which, for the first time, owing to its unsuccess, appeared useless and terrible. One of the generals who wrote it to Napoleon allowed himself to suggest that he send the old guard into action. Ney and Berthier, who stood near Napoleon, exchanged glances and smiled contemptuously at the general's absurd suggestion. Napoleon lowered his head and said nothing for a long time. Et 800 lieues de France je ne ferai démolir ma garde. At 800 leagues from France, I won't have my guard annihilated, he said, and turning his horse, rode back to Shevardino. And that's where we will stop it for today. The destruction of Napoleon's forces. What shall we see? Well, I think that was a rather exciting sort of battle. It was interesting because there wasn't maybe as much detail as some of the other ones, but I really loved Pierre's sort of perspective on things because he's so unused to battle. So he just kind of like jolly hangs out with the cannon, the cannon and the artillery brigade, and just sort of like do becomes sort of like a mascot for a minute. And then's like in the middle of battle and kind of freaks out. And yeah, Napoleon, he never had to face defeat before, and here he is staring him down. And now I love that, the idea of the man who gambles and never and always wins on chance and never has to calculate. Now he's actually calculating and thinks he has a chance of winning by his calculations, is actually going to lose. So yeah. Yeah, he was a very cocky person. But that's kind of what got him as far as he did. He had a good sense of his own, inflated sense of his own ability, and that's probably what got him quite far, actually. But all empires must fall. So yeah, but that takes us to the 2/3 of the way through the book. Take a look at that, friends. We are making progress. 2/3 of the way through. We'll be done before you know it. Especially if we really dig in and read with gusto in the next couple weeks. Yeah, and I think by tomorrow we'll be through part 2 in volume 3. I think there's only 3 parts in volume 3, so yeah. And I think there's only 4 volumes, so yeah, we're really making progress. We'll be done before you know it. All right. Have a great rest of your day. Contemplate all the things, all the absurdity and repeating history of humanity, and have a great day. Stay safe and do good out there, peeps. See you tomorrow. Bye.